Chapter 2, The Seed and the Snare. 11,000 years ago, on a bare limestone ridge in what is now southeastern Turkey, hundreds of people are dragging a block of stone the size of a delivery truck across the ground. And there is no reason on earth they should be doing it. They have no wheels, no draft animals, no oxen, no horses, nothing tamed to pull. No metal tools, the stone was cut from the bedrock with other stones. No writing, no kings, no cities, no farms. These are hunter-gatherers, foragers, exactly the kind of people who have roamed the earth for 100,000 years, living off what the land freely gives. And yet here they are, in numbers that must have taken weeks to gather and feed, hauling a carved pillar of limestone weighing perhaps 10 or 15 tons up a hill to stand it upright in a ring with others just like it. Some of these pillars rise higher than a house. Each one is shaped like a great capital T, and their broad faces are carved, beautifully, unmistakably carved, with a menagerie of wild creatures. Foxes mid-leap, boars with bristling backs, snakes pouring down the stone, scorpions, vultures, a lion baring its teeth. Around some of the pillars, a stylized arm reaches down the side, ending in long human fingers folded across a carved belt, as though the standing stone were the abstracted body of some enormous being. This place is called Göbekli Tepe, and when a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt began to understand what he had found there in the 1990s, it broke the story we had been telling ourselves about how civilization began. Because the story went like this. First, somehow, people learned to farm. Farming produced extra food, a surplus. The surplus freed some people from the daily grind of finding dinner, and those freed hands built the first villages, and then the first towns, and then, when there was wealth enough to spare, they raised temples and carved gods and invented religion. Bread came first. The sacred came last. You had to fill the belly before you could lift your eyes to heaven. Göbekli Tepe says, not so fast. It was built before farming, before pottery, before the wheel, before metal, before writing, before the village. It is the oldest known monumental religious site on the planet, and it was raised not by a settled, well-fed, tax-paying civilization but by roving bands of hunters, people who, by every rule of the old story, should not have been able to organize such a thing at all. And it gets stranger. When Schmidt's team dug down, they found that the great stone rings had not simply been abandoned when their builders moved on. They had been deliberately buried, carefully packed with rubble, and covered over by the very people who made them, as though the temple had a lifespan and had reached the end of it, and needed to be laid to rest like a body in a grave. Schmidt drew a heretical conclusion, and though scholars still argue over every part of it, the challenge it poses hasn't gone away. What if the old story runs backwards? What if it wasn't surplus that produced the temple, but the temple that produced the surplus? Picture it. To gather hundreds of people on that ridge, again and again, across generations, to feed them while they hauled and carved, you would need an astonishing amount of food in one place at one time. Perhaps the need to feed the faithful is what first drove people, in the hills all around, to stop merely gathering wild grain and start growing it, to plant and tend, and harvest and store, so that the work of the gods could go on. If Schmidt was right, then the profoundest revolution in human history may have been set in motion not by hunger but by wonder. First the temple, then the field. We don't know if it happened that way, but we know something changed, all across the world, in the span of a few thousand years, and it changed us more than anything had since the mind first woke up in the dark of the caves. It is called the Neolithic Revolution, and almost everything you think of when you think of is downstream of it. It also may have been, from the point of view of the people who lived through it, one of the worst things that ever happened to them. This chapter is about that double face, about the single most consequential bargain our species ever struck, and the terrible price written in the fine print. To understand what the farmers did, you first have to understand what the world had just done to them. For the last 100,000 years, the earth had been locked in an ice age, not frozen everywhere, but colder, drier, and above all wilder, its climate swinging violently from century to century. It was a hard world to settle down in, because you could never count on anything. The rains, the herds, the plants all shifting under your feet. Then, a little under 12,000 years ago, the ice loosened its grip for good. The planet warmed and, crucially, steadied. We call this new, gentler epoch the Holocene, and we're living in it still. For the first time in the entire history of our species, human beings found themselves in a world stable enough, and generous enough, to gamble on the future. And in a curved band of land arcing through the modern Middle East, from the valleys of Israel and Syria up through the Turkish highlands and down along the Tigris and Euphrates, a region we call the Fertile Crescent, that gamble began. But it did not begin, as you might expect, with someone planting a seed. It began with people simply staying put. In the hills of the Levant lived a people archaeologists call the Natufians, and they made an astonishing discovery. The wild wheat and barley growing thick on the hillsides was so abundant that you didn't have to wander to live off it. You could settle down beside it. So they did. Thousands of years before true farming, the Natufians built villages of round stone houses and stayed in them, harvesting the wild grain with sickles of flint, grinding it on stone, storing it, living in one place beside the pantry nature had provided. Settling came first. Farming came second, and it came, most likely, out of desperation. Because the good times didn't last. A cold, dry snap gripped the region. The wild grain grew scarcer, and the settled people faced a choice: scatter back into the wandering life their ancestors had lived, or find a way to make the grain grow where they needed it. Some of them, in some places, chose to intervene. They took seeds from the plants they liked best, the ones with the biggest grains, the ones whose stalks held onto their seeds instead of scattering them to the wind, and they put those seeds into the ground on purpose, and they waited. Sit with that gesture, because it is the whole chapter in miniature, and it is the direct child of the awakening we watched in chapter 1. To plant a seed is one of the strangest things an animal can do. It means taking food you could eat right now, food, while you are hungry, and burying it in the dirt instead. It means turning your back on the sure thing in your hand, for the sake of a harvest that does not yet exist, that you cannot see or touch, that lives only in your imagination, and that is months away and may never come at all. No other creature does this. The squirrel that buries a nut is running on ancient instinct. It does not picture the winter and reason about it. But the farmer plans. The farmer holds in the mind a vivid, detailed future, the green shoots, the ripening ears, the full granary against the coming cold, and then sacrifices the present to serve it. Farming is the mind that can imagine what is not there, from chapter 1, scaled up into an entire way of life. It is the invented future made real, one buried seed at a time. And once you start burying seeds, something else begins, something no one intended and no one could see. The plants start to change. Here is a fact that ought to be more famous than it is. The wheat in your bread cannot survive without us. Left alone in a field, modern domesticated wheat would fail within a few generations, because we bred it, without meaning to, into total dependence. It happened through the simplest process imaginable. A wild grass scatters its ripe seeds explosively, that's how it spreads, flinging its children to the wind. But every so often a freak plant is born, whose seeds don't scatter, they cling stubbornly to the stalk. In the wild, that's a death sentence, the plant can't sow itself. But for a human being walking through the field with a sickle, that clingy freak is a gift. It's the one whose grain is still there to be harvested when you arrive. So, unknowingly, you gather more seeds from the plants that hold their grain, and you carry them home, and some spill and some get planted, and the next year there are a few more clingy plants. And you harvest those, and on and on. Generation by generation, without any plan, the farmers filled their fields with plants that could no longer sow themselves, and now depended utterly on human hands to reproduce. The same slow magic swelled the grains bigger, thinned their tough husks, made them ripen all at once for easy reaping. We reshaped the plant. And the plant, in the bargain, reshaped us, chaining our whole species to the endless labor of sowing and reaping the crop that could no longer live without us. The historian Yuval Noah Harari put the provocation memorably. We like to say that we domesticated wheat, but you could just as fairly say that wheat domesticated us. This scraggly wild grass, he pointed out, tricked one species of clever ape into clearing its competitors, watering it, guarding it, and hauling its seeds across the entire planet until today it blankets vast stretches of the Earth's surface, and we have organized our whole existence around its needs. Who exactly domesticated whom? Nowhere is the transformation more jaw-dropping than with corn. If you had walked through ancient Mexico 9,000 years ago and someone had pointed to a certain scrubby wild grass called teosinte and told you that this plant would one day feed the world, you would have laughed. Teosinte looks nothing like corn. It's a weedy tangle, and it's a pathetic little things, a mere handful of kernels, maybe a dozen, each one locked inside a shell so hard you could break a tooth on it. And yet the farmers of Mesoamerica, choosing and replanting the best of the best across countless generations, transformed that miserable grass into maize, the fat golden ear, heavy with hundreds of soft, sweet kernels. A plant so utterly remade that for a long time botanists couldn't even agree on what it had descended from. It is one of the most dramatic makeovers in the history of life, and it was performed not by nature but by people, patiently, over thousands of years, without any idea of what they were doing to the plant's inner machinery, reaching into the deep code of a living thing and rewriting it by hand, long before anyone knew that such a code existed. The animals came under the same spell. The wolf, drawn to the edges of the hunters' camps by scraps and warmth, was tamed into the dog, our first companion, domesticated before farming even began, the opening move in the whole long game. Then, as villages spread, came the rest, sheep and goats, then pigs, then cattle, each one bred over generations to be tamer, smaller horned, more useful to give more meat. More milk, more wool, more muscle. The wild ox, a huge and dangerous beast, was gentled into the cow. And here we arrive at something the previous chapter should make us feel in the gut. Remember the animals of the cave walls, the horses and lions and bulls painted by torchlight, summoned out of the stone with such reverence, treated, it seems, almost as persons, powerful spirits. Kin, beings to be honored and feared. Now those same animals were being penned, bred, milked, sheared, and slaughtered on a schedule. The bear that had been a brother was becoming a resource. Something in the ancient relationship between us and the rest of the living world was quietly, permanently breaking, and we will spend the rest of this book watching science slowly, painfully piece it back together. And now the detail that turns this from a regional story into something that whispers of the deep nature of our kind. It did not happen only in the Fertile Crescent. Farming was invented, from scratch, by people who had never heard of one another and never could have, in at least 7 separate places around the globe. In China, along the Yangtze and Yellow rivers, people domesticated rice and millet. In Mexico and Central America, maize and beans and squash. High in the Andes, the potato and quinoa. In the highlands of New Guinea, taro and banana. In Africa, south of the Sahara, sorghum and yams. Even in the eastern woodlands of North America, on a smaller scale, sunflowers and other seed plants. Different continents. Different plants. Different peoples, with no possible contact between them, some of them separated by whole oceans. And within a window of a few thousand years, a heartbeat, on the geological scale, they all independently made the same leap. Keep that pattern in mind, because we're going to meet it again. There is something about the human animal such that, given the same push, a warming world, a growing pressure, a mind that can imagine tomorrow, it will reach again and again for the same profound idea. Entirely on its own, on opposite sides of the earth. We saw a hint of it already, with symbolic thought perhaps flickering to life in more than one kind of human. We will see it blaze in a few chapters, when philosophy and ethics and the very idea of a truth beyond custom erupt simultaneously in China and India and Greece and Israel, again with no one comparing notes. The great ideas, it seems, are not lucky accidents that happened once and might just as easily never have happened. They're more like something waiting in the landscape of possibility, ready to be found by any mind that wanders close enough. Farming was the first of these deep human discoveries to prove it, the first idea the whole species reached for at once, in the dark, alone, together. So this is the triumph, a warming world, a mind that could plan, and human beings all over the planet learning to bend life itself to their will, and wring food from the ground. Surely this is the great leap forward, the moment we finally got ahead, the dawn of the good life. Except that it wasn't. And this is where the chapter turns, and where the bones tell a story the monuments don't. Dig up the skeletons of the first farmers and lay them beside the skeletons of the foragers who came just before them, and the farmers lose on nearly every count. They are shorter, in some regions the coming of agriculture shaved inches off the average human height, a loss it would take thousands of years to win back. Their teeth are wrecked, riddled with cavities from a soft, starchy, grain-heavy diet and ground down by the grit of stone-milled flour. Their bones show the telltale scars of anemia, of vitamin deficiency, of bodies not getting enough of what they needed. Their joints are worn and deformed by lifetimes of the same grinding, repetitive toil, bending, planting, harvesting, hauling water, turning the millstone. And they died younger, and buried more of their children, than the hunters had. In 1987, the scientist Jared Diamond wrote a short, deliberately provocative essay that has haunted the field ever since. He called the invention of agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race. His argument was blunt. The foragers we had always pictured as living lives that were nasty, brutish, and short, had in fact often lived rather well, working fewer hours than farmers, eating a wonderfully varied diet of dozens of wild plants and animals, ranging free and rarely knowing famine, because if one food failed, there were always others. The farmer, by contrast, bet everything on a handful of crops, and sometimes just one. When that crop failed, when the rains didn't come, when the blight struck, there was no fallback. There was famine. A field of wheat is a feast and a death sentence living in the same soil. And the farmer, unlike the forager, had put all his eggs in that single golden basket. And the crowding brought a horror the foragers had rarely known. Plague. Wandering bands are too small and too scattered for an epidemic to take hold. The disease burns through a handful of people and has nowhere to jump. But a village is a tinderbox, and a town is worse. Pack hundreds of people together, add their waste, their stored grain crawling with rats, and above all the animals now living cheek by jowl with them, the cattle in the byre, the pigs in the yard, the chickens underfoot, and you have built the perfect nursery for disease. Many of the illnesses that would go on to terrorize humanity for the next 10,000 years leapt into our species from the animals we had domesticated. Measles and tuberculosis appear to have come to us from cattle. Influenza brews to this day in the crowded company of pigs and birds. Other scourges rode in from the herds and flocks we had gathered close for food. The farmer's animals fed him in life and, all too often, killed him in the end. Every epidemic in human history, every plague, every pandemic, right down to the ones in living memory, traces its deepest roots to this moment. The moment we stopped roaming and packed ourselves and our beasts together behind the walls. Which raises the maddening question. If farming made people shorter, sicker, more overworked, and more likely to starve or to die coughing in a crowded village, why on earth did anyone keep doing it? The answer is the cruel genius of the thing, and it is worth understanding, because it is a trap that human beings have walked into over and over since. Farming has one overwhelming advantage: an acre of planted grain feeds far more people than an acre of wild land ever could. The life is worse, but you can support many more of it. And more food means more babies survive, and more surviving babies means more mouths. And more mouths mean you need to plant even more. And very quickly your population swells to a size that the old foraging life could no longer possibly feed. And there is the snare, snapping shut behind you. You cannot go back. There are simply too many of you now. Whatever your grandparents gave up when they buried that first seed, you can never reclaim it, because the wild land could never again hold all the people that the fields had brought into being. The extra food didn't make anyone's life better, it just made more life, hungrier life, and a one-way door that locked behind the whole species. We didn't choose farming because it was good. We were caught by it because it was fertile, and by the time the cost came due, the bill could never be unpaid. So the surplus did not buy leisure and ease, as the old story promised. What then did it buy? It bought something stranger and more fateful than comfort. It bought inequality, permanent, structural, inheritable inequality, and with it, the entire architecture of power that we still live inside today. Think about what a granary really is. Wild food can't be hoarded, a gathered berry rots, a hunted deer must be eaten or shared before it spoils. And so among foragers, there is a natural ceiling on how much any one person can accumulate. You simply cannot get very rich on things that go bad. But grain is different. Grain is dry and hard, and it keeps, for months, for years. Grain can be piled up, measured out, counted, locked away. Grain, for the first time in human history, is wealth you can store. And the instant wealth can be stored, everything changes. It can be hoarded by some and denied to others. It can be lent out and paid back with interest, the birth of debt. It can be seized by force. It can be handed down from a father to his sons, so that some families begin each generation rich and others begin poor forever. And someone, inevitably, comes to control the store, to hold the key to the granary and decide who eats. That person, and that person's heirs, become something the human world had never really seen before: a ruling class. The political scientist James C. Scott argued that this is the very secret of how states themselves were born, and his insight is deliciously subversive. Why, he asked, are the first states everywhere built on grain, on wheat, barley, rice, maize, and never on, say, potatoes, even where potatoes grow well and feed people fine? Because grain, unlike a potato buried in the ground, ripens all at once, above the soil, in plain sight, on a known schedule. Which means it can be found, counted, and taxed. A tax collector can stand in a field of wheat and see exactly how much is there and take his share on the spot. Try that with a hillside of tubers a forager digs up one at a time, as needed, invisible underground until the moment of eating you can't. Grain, Scott argued, is the one crop legible to power, the one you can assess and seize, and so the state and the cereal grew up together, hand in hand. The granary, the tax, the record, the ruler, the soldier who enforces it all. Civilization, on this telling, was not a gift the surplus gave to grateful humanity. It was a cage the surplus made possible, and grain was the bait. And out of this came another idea so audacious it should stop us in our tracks, an act of imagination every bit as bold as the painted hand on the cave wall, though far darker in its consequences. People began to believe that a piece of the earth could belong to someone. Think how strange this is. The ground was here for 4.5 billion years before any human drew breath. It will be here long after we are gone. It can no more truly be owned than the sky or the sea. And yet the settled farmer, who had poured a year of sweat into a particular field, who had cleared it and plowed it and would starve if a stranger reaped it, came to feel and then to insist, and then to enforce with weapons and with law, that this land is mine. The fence went up. The boundary stone was planted. And the whole subsequent history of the world, its wars and its laws and its revolutions, its lords and its serfs, its empires and its bitter fights over who owns what, unspools from that first invisible line drawn in the dirt. This is mine, and that is yours, and you may not cross. Notice too, which way the moral circle bends here, because in this book we're tracking that circle, and this is the first place it turns the wrong way. Among the wandering bands, differences in status had been real, but shallow and personal. There was little to inherit and nowhere to store great wealth, so a rough equality held. Farming shattered it. Now there were the propertied and the propertyless, the free and, before long, the enslaved. For a settled society with fields to work and surplus to spare found brutal new uses for captured human beings, and slavery, rare or absent among foragers, became a bedrock institution of the farming world. And a darker turn still. Once a man's wealth passed to his sons, it mattered urgently whose sons they were, and so many scholars argue, came a new and heavy machinery of control over women in their reproduction, tightening across the farming world into the deep patterns of patriarchy that would shadow human societies for thousands of years to come. The circle of who truly counted, which had been small but not so steeply ranked, now hardened into rigid tiers of the high and the low. We bought the future, and we paid for it in one another. Beneath all of it, the granaries, the fences, the kings, the plagues, two deep changes were reshaping the human mind itself, so quietly that no one at the time could have named them. And they are the real reason this moment belongs in a history of ideas and not just a history of stomachs. The first was a new relationship with time. The forager lives, in a sense, inside an eternal present. The world provides today what it provided yesterday and will provide tomorrow. Life moves in great turning cycles, the seasons wheeling round, the same and the same and the same. But the farmer cannot live in the present. The farmer is always somewhere else, always working towards something not yet here. You plow in one season for a harvest in another. You save seed grain through the hungry months, forbidding yourself to eat what could be planted. You watch the sky and count the days and calculate whether the store will last the winter. Time stops being a wheel you ride around and becomes an arrow you fire ahead of yourself, a line running from a remembered past, through an anxious present, toward a future you must constantly plan against or perish. The whole texture of human experience shifted, from being in time to being at war with it, forever racing the calendar, forever deferring, forever anxious about the year to come. That anxiety, that forward lean, that inability to simply be here now, is one of the oldest inheritances of the farming life, and we carry it still, most of us, every single day. The second change was even deeper, and it is the one that echoes farthest through everything ahead. The forager, like the cave painter, lived inside nature, one creature among the herds, embedded in a living web of plants and animals that were kin, spirits, persons, powers. The farmer stepped outside it. To farm is to stand apart from the natural world and act upon it, to clear the wild and impose the field, to decide which plants shall live and which are to be torn out, which animals shall breed and which shall be slaughtered, to remake a whole landscape to serve human ends. For the first time, human beings stopped seeing themselves as part of nature and started seeing nature as a thing, a resource, an opponent, a material to be managed and mastered and owned. This was, in its way, the exact opposite of every great discovery still to come in this book. The long arc ahead is a story of decentering, of humbling, of learning again and again, that we are not so separate, not so central, not so special. That we are a small planet, a twig on the tree of life, an animal among animals. But here, at the dawn of farming, we did the reverse. We climbed up out of the web of life and set ourselves above it, apart from it, in charge of it. We centered ourselves, and nearly everything science has done since. From Darwin's tree to the discovery that we are made of the same code as a blade of grass to the modern reckoning with a planet we have altered, past recognition has been, in part, the slow and often unwelcome work of putting us back where we came from, inside nature, not above it. We are still, 10,000 years later, arguing about the mistake we made when we first picked up the plow. So here is the balance sheet on the greatest bargain our species ever struck. On one side of the ledger, shorter lives, ruined teeth, backbreaking toil, famine, plague, slavery, and the birth of every inequality that has cursed the human world since, bought at the cost of the free and healthy wandering life our ancestors had lived for 100,000 years, and of our old, deep belonging to the living world. And on the other side, everything else in this book, because make no mistake, every wonder still to come grew from that stored grain and that settled ground. The city could not exist without the surplus to feed it. Writing, as we're about to see, was invented to count the grain. Mathematics began as the accounting of fields and harvests and debts. The freeing of a few hands from the endless search for food is what made possible the priest, the scribe, the astronomer, the philosopher, everyone who would ever have the leisure to sit and wonder and think and build. The temple at Göbekli Tepe, the pyramids, the Parthenon, the library, the university, the laboratories, Plato and the Buddha and Newton and Darwin. This sentence, and the mind reading it, none of it, not one word or one thought of it, could have come to be without that fateful moment when a hungry, frightened people buried food they could have eaten and chose to gamble on a harvest they could only imagine. It was a Faustian bargain in the fullest sense. We sold something precious, and we can never entirely buy it back, and in exchange we got the whole towering, glittering, blood-soaked edifice of civilization. Whether the trade was worth it is a question you will have to answer for yourself, and it is one worth carrying with you through every chapter that follows, because in one form or another we are still making that same bargain today, still trading the wild and the free and the whole for the powerful and the plentiful and the new. But the trade was made, the seed was planted, the people stayed, and the villages grew into towns, and the towns swelled with grain and with people and with all the tangled new relations of who owns what and who owes whom and who rules over whom. And soon the granaries grew so full, and the debts so many, and the kingdoms so large, that the old way of keeping track, remembering it all in a human head, passing it down by word of mouth, simply broke under the weight. There was too much to remember. Too many bushels, too many debts, too many names, too many days. The mind that could imagine the future now needed a way to hold it, outside the skull, on something that would not forget, would not die, would not misremember. It needed to make a mark that stood not for a hand this time, but for a number, 3 sheep, 10 measures of barley, the debt owed by this man to that temple. Memory was about to leave the body, and when it did, the past itself would change forever.